United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, but begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out.
It's been 1 year since President Trump made that announcement, saying the Paris Climate Agreement would cause irreparable harm to the U.S. economy. But according to a study from Stanford University researchers, following climate accord goals could save more than $20 trillion. Noah Diffenbaugh is a professor and senior fellow at Stanford University. He joins me now from Stanford, California. Noah, thanks for being with us. Can you break down your research for us? How exactly would climate change hurt the economy?
Well, when we think about the economic value of an agreement like the Paris Climate Agreement, it's really about both costs and benefits. And when the president announced his intention to withdraw the U.S. 1 year ago today, he emphasized the costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to curb global warming. But the other side of the ledger is that we know that extreme climate events and other climate stresses impede economic growth. And so to really understand the value, we have to look at not only the costs of achieving those Paris goals, but also the benefits in terms of the avoided damages. And what we find in this study is that, in fact, the avoided damages from reaching a lower level of global warming are likely to far outweigh the previously published estimates of the costs of achieving those goals set out in the UN Paris Agreement.
And tell me a little bit about your process. How did you and your colleagues go about quantifying this data?
Well, so we've taken an empirical approach. That is, we've looked back historically at the data that exists in terms of the year-to-year variation in temperature in different countries, the year-to-year variation in economic growth. So we've controlled country by country for focusing just on within that country what's happened during relatively warm years historically, what's happened during relatively cool years historically. And what we find is that very clearly warm countries, when they experience years that are extra warm, their economic growth is inhibited. Cool countries, on the other hand, when they experience warmer than average years, their economic growth is helped. And what we find in this study is that that really most of the countries in the world are already so warm that they're likely to experience worse economic growth at higher levels of global warming. So we find, more than 3/4 of the countries in the world, encompassing more than 90% of the population, is likely to benefit from achieving the lower levels of global warming. And this includes the United States and China and Japan, which are the three largest economies in the world, as well as most of the poor countries in the world.
And to the extent of saving $20 trillion globally, what's the time frame for that?
Well, we've looked at two time frames. We've looked at the near-term decades out towards the middle of this century, the next 3 decades or so, and then we've also looked at the longer time frame to the end of the century. And what we find, which you would expect because you and your viewers already know about compound interest, the longer the time frame that we look at, the bigger the savings, because those year-to-year benefits of experiencing greater economic growth with less warming, those compound. And when we look out over a century, that's where we see those very large global benefits in the trillions of dollars.
Did you also calculate the cost of preventing global warming to sort of compare?
So in this study, we focused on the damages from the temperature change historically and what we're likely to see in the future. So in this study, we're quantifying the benefits of avoiding higher levels of
right.
global warming. There is established research on the costs of achieving those lower levels of global warming. So when we look at, for example, the most recent estimates of what it would take from a cost perspective globally to achieve a pathway consistent with those lower levels of global warming identified in the UN Paris Agreement, we find that the benefits that we calculate are at least 10 times as large as those previously estimated costs of getting onto that lower pathway.
So the bottom line is preventing global warming is good business, basically.
Yeah, so if you want to evaluate the value of an investment, you need to look not only at the cost of the investment, but also the benefits that investment will yield. And in this case, it's clear that both at the global level and at the national level, for most countries, including the United States, we're very likely to see benefits that far outweigh the costs.
So, Noah, in an interview on CBS This Morning Friday, former New York City mayor and billionaire philanthropist Michael Bloomberg talked about a new initiative to help the U.S. achieve the Paris Accord goals. I want to play some sound from that interview.
Most of the stuff, if you switch, for example, from coal to natural gas, you save a lot of money. If you switch from natural gas to solar and wind, you save a lot more money. So the coal-fired power plants want to move. And so far, something like 268 coal-fired power plants have announced that they're closing out of 530. And that's brought down greenhouse gases a lot in America.
So do businesses themselves need to take on the brunt of fighting climate change, since the Trump administration and some other countries don't seem to have the leadership in this regard?
Well, so certainly we're seeing market forces that are affecting the trajectory of global emissions. In the U.S., very clearly, as Mayor Bloomberg was describing in that clip, we're seeing the substitution of natural gas in place of coal, and this is a very strong economic force where the innovation that's yielded the fracking boom, which has its own environmental concerns, but from a perspective of greenhouse gas emissions, we are seeing reductions as natural gas replaces coal. Now, it's important to note that in order to achieve the goals laid out in the Paris Agreement, it will take more than substituting natural gas for coal. In fact, to stabilize the global temperature at any level, essentially the global energy system will need to be a net zero emitter of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So we have a lot of people in the world, we have a lot of energy demand, and part of the challenge is how do we meet the world's energy needs while decarbonizing the energy system in terms of meeting the Paris goals.
Now, you also talk about the difficulty of convincing individual countries to see the benefits of the whole. How can you go about doing that? I mean, is your research the first step?
Well, so, one of the key elements of our new study that came out last week is that we've looked not only at the global level economic benefits, but we've also looked at the country level. And so when we go through country by country and ask whether or not countries are likely to benefit from achieving the targets laid out in the Paris Agreement, what we find is that the vast majority of countries are, in fact, likely to benefit. They're likely to experience less economic damage at lower levels of global warming. And not only is it most countries, but it's really most people living in countries today. In terms of those countries that are likely to benefit, it encompasses more than 90% of the global population. So it's not only a global level benefit that we're finding in this research, but also when we look country by country, it really is very likely to pay off for most country and most populations in the world.
But do you feel that the governments of these countries, of most countries, are getting the message? Well,
the Paris Agreement has secured broad approval through that process. That's what is represented in the Paris Agreement, is the agreement of the countries of the world. The United States, obviously, President Trump has announced his intention to withdraw the United States from that agreement. But when we look across the world, we find that not only most countries are likely to benefit, but the United States is likely to benefit when we compare the costs of achieving the lower levels of global warming with the damage that will be avoided. It turns out to be a very large return on investment in terms of allowing the economy to grow at a rate that at the lower level of global warming relative to the higher level of global warming.
So it's just good business. Professor Noah Diffenbaugh, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
The Trump